You know what's worse than a water level? A sewer level, of course. Yet that didn't stop Banjo Kazooie's third game world from doing both at the same time. Hey everyone, it's me, Mechadusto, and today we're looking at Clanker's Cavern, a pretty interesting idea that mostly worked in execution. Clanker's Cavern is basically the polar opposite of the previous world, Treasure Trove Cove. Where Treasure Trove Cove was clear and open, Clanker's Cavern is closed off and claustrophobic. Where Treasure Trove Cove is bright and cheery, Clanker's Cavern is just plain ugly. The big idea here is you're in the home of a colossal cybernetic shark named Clanker. The level revolves around this metal fish, literally. You'll be quickly getting familiar with the shark's insides and outsides as you hunt for collectibles. Progression is a bit more convoluted this time around. Initially you're locked into a fairly small chamber acting as a bit of a lobby. Really the only thing to get initially is a Jinjo, but it does introduce you to some pesky monsters you'll be encountering throughout the level. These giant lungfish things are called Grill Champas, and they're a new, fairly infuriating enemy class that pop out of grills. Their main purpose is to apply friction, slowing you down in sometimes difficult areas. I consider them infuriating because they're very awkward to hit. And since there's no indicator that a hole in the wall has a monster in it, you're gonna have to stop every time, just in case you forgot one was there. There is a sound cue announcing there's one hiding, but if you're running at full speed, it's generally too late. Anyways, moving on, go through the pipe and you'll meet Clanker himself in a horrific jump scare that would traumatize just about any kid at the time. This is like that eel from Super Mario 64, except 10 times worse. Honestly, I'm not sure if it was intentional or not. There's a high chance the pipe bend is there just so the game can unload the previous lobby room so it doesn't suck up too much RAM. It'd be kinda hilarious if the jump scare was due to technical restraints, but who knows. Before you can really do much of anything, you're gonna have to raise Clanker through use of a key deep underwater. This has a very high likelihood in resulting in your first death in the game via drowning. Swimming controls can be really awkward to use, and if your breath meter runs out, it's an insta-death. You can refill your air via bubbles from this fish thing that swims around, but still. The swimming responds well, but movement is relative to the camera, and the camera just kinda does whatever it wants. Speaking of camera though, it's worth noting that Clanker's Cavern is a bit of a marvel when it comes to platformer camera work. Sure, it isn't perfect, but interior levels with a lot of cramped spaces are very difficult to make a camera work with, and the Cavern does a pretty good job at it. The main area has a free cam that just sort of does its own thing following you around, but once you go into any of the smaller side areas or Clanker himself, it'll switch over to a smartly placed fixed camera angle. Unfortunately, you have to work with the free cam to free Clanker, but hey, it gets the job done. Also, a neat little developer trick here, when you get super deep, the music dampens a bit and you hear an almost ominous continuous high note, making you feel the pressure before getting out of there. With Clanker raised, you can now access the rest of the level, though there isn't really all that much to access, all things considered. The level's a bit short. This whole unlocking a chunk of a level shtick isn't unique to Clanker's Cavern either, with a good portion of the game worlds having areas that require some legwork to bust into. In this case, it's the level's namesake, Clanker himself, who you'll mostly be exploring. Clanker isn't just a quest-giving NPC, he fills a lot of roles. He serves as your obligatory landmark for exploring the level. There's a bunch of little side rooms and little nooks to explore throughout the cave, though the samey textures means you're gonna have to rely on Clanker's position to consistently navigate. The cybernetic shark takes up like 80% of the level playing space, and you'll be getting familiar with him real quick. For whatever reason, levels taking place inside of giant creatures was a bit of a trope back then, though in this case the mechanical nature sort of makes it a bit more believable. The low-res textures here leave it somewhat ambiguous what exactly Clanker is. At a glance he gives the impression of being a robot, but there's a lot of biological gunk in there. I like it, it's almost unnerving, it pulls you in. Which is good because you have to go in and out of every conceivable orifice on this guy. Also, as a weird little side note, Clanker looked like a normal shark in the beta. While this is probably just due to the textures being unfinished, it's kind of fun to speculate. As far as the actually beating Clanker's Cavern part goes, you have a lot of options here, and the game doesn't really nudge you one way or the other. Which Clanker hole you enter is going to determine where inside of him you end up, and certain Jiggies are a bit picky as far as how you approach them. They're all fairly obvious, however, so as long as you're thorough, you're gonna breeze right on through. While order doesn't really matter all that much, I would definitely recommend picking up the Wonder Wing ability pretty early. It's introduced to you via a death chamber, countless spinning blades eager to hack up poor Banjo into mincemeat. With the temporary invincibility of Wonder Wing, you can sprint on through. Ironically, I would actually consider this to be a very poor introduction to the ability. Initially, I thought it was going to be way too niche to actually get some use, but I found myself using it a ton, not on death rooms, but on irritating enemies. In fact, some enemies can only be killed through Wonder Wing, but none of those are in Clanker's Cavern, meaning you might not realize what you have access to. There's actually another Jiggy off the beaten path that involves getting mauled by a bunch of mutant snippers, a type of crab. Technically, this would be the level's mini-boss, though there's not much to it. Wonder Wing makes this fight downright trivial, but there's a good chance you'll find this place before you actually get the move from Bottles. The bit of jank here results from the fact that Banjo has a bit of a vulnerability window when attacking enemies that take multiple hits, a fact you can safely ignore when melting your way through them via your golden feathers with Wonder Wing. Speaking of gold feathers, they're another resource that the player now has to worry about, though you won't be burning them all too often, especially in Clanker's Cavern where your primary concern is water, or the occasional fall. Most of the Jiggies here are haphazardly spread throughout the level, gated through a bit of platforming or swimming. This is only the third world, so things are still pretty easy. A clever little Jiggy involves spitting eggs to knock out Clanker's bad teeth to gain access to a Jiggy in his mouth. There's also a Jiggy which can only be accessed by realizing you can ride the cork in Clanker's blowhole when it gets fired upwards. These challenges do a pretty good job at rewarding the player for paying attention to their surroundings. Also worth noting, the level's platforming is very lenient, as 9 times out of 10, you're gonna land in water if you do screw up. The last Jiggy of note is, it's a ring challenge of all things. Hop through a bunch of rings in a time limit and you'll get a prize by raising the water level. Note that this is most likely the first time a rare game implemented a ring challenge, well, a 3D rare game, and regretfully it wouldn't be the last. The idea of traversing a timed obstacle course is very fun in theory, but almost always ends up being frustrating in these types of games, and they just won't go away. Hell, even Ukulele had these things. On the topic of frustration, we still have one more major collectible to get, and that's the notes. Most of these are underwater, sometimes extremely deep underwater. You're going to want to get every single one. Unlike the sequel Banjo-Tooie, Banjo Kazooie was actually pretty strict when it comes to completion percentage. You'll be needing to collect so many Jiggies and notes to beat this game, you might as well go for 100% in the early levels. Unless you want to end up backtracking, which you probably don't. So now we've cleared the course, and it wasn't all too bad for a water level. But what about the more subjective things like music and visuals? Well, I mean, it's a sewer. It's pretty hideous, but that's kind of the idea here. Clanker himself looks fantastic, though. His animations and textures look pretty great for something that big at the time. There's also some nice smaller details, like the fact his eyes follow you around, that really bring him to life. He's definitely the star of the show here. An unfortunate consequence of this is that the rest of the level suffers quite a bit. Much of the rest of the cavern looks pretty samey. The colors and detailing are okay, but it doesn't quite hold up as well as the later game worlds. The music, on the other hand, is pretty much perfect. Catchy, but still matching the level's theme perfectly. Overall, I'd say Clanker's Cavern was an okay level. It's a bit slower, and it puts a lot of emphasis on spatial awareness and figuring out which parts of the cavern you haven't explored yet, which I'd say is a good change of pace. The idea of this giant mechanical shark was executed flawlessly. That being said, though, everything outside of Clanker himself came off as a bit clunky, and a water level was always going to be somewhat doomed due to the swimming controls. So in conclusion, good. Not great, but good, it's solid. Clanker would be seen again in Banjo Kazooie Nuts and Bolts, but I'd rather not go into detail. Anyways, that's all for this time. If you liked what you see, subscribe or something, I don't know. Until next time, see ya!